The last bells of Thessaly. The bells rang at dawn, not to welcome prayer, but to warn of an ending. High in the hills of Thessaly, where olive trees bent under cold autumn wind, the convent stood alone, its white walls stained by time and smoke from old winters. The sisters gathered beneath fading frescoes, where saints no longer had faces, scraped away by damp and neglect. Outside, the horizon burned. Thin lines of fire moved across the ridges as Ottoman banners appeared, red cloth catching the light like embers carried by the wind. No messengers came from nearby towns. No soldiers climbed the road to defend them. The silence answered every question they were afraid to ask, not their abbess. Sister Eleni of Lissa stood before the altar, holding a silver crucifix darkened by age. It had survived storms, theft, and decades of quiet devotion. Her voice did not rise when she spoke. She told them to keep their vows inside their hearts, where no blade could reach. She believed faith could remain untouched if bodies were lost. Around her, the sisters listened without tears. They had lived lives of discipline and denial. Fear was not new. But something heavier pressed on the room now, the knowledge that this was not a passing raid. It was conquest. By midday, the sound of cannon rolled through the hills. The first stones of the convent wall collapsed before sundown. The Ottomans did not treat holy places as sacred ground. To them, a convent was a statement, proof that the cross still stood on land already claimed by empire. Iron shattered the gates. Smoke filled the corridors. Hymns were swallowed by shouting and the crack of wood breaking apart. Inside, the sisters hid their relics beneath the chapel floor, silver chalices, embroidered icons, fragments of bone wrapped in cloth. They believed that if memory survived, loss might still have meaning. By nightfall, the survivors were driven into the courtyard. Torchlight turned white habits into shifting gold and shadow. They were told they would be taken before authority, a promise that carried little hope. As ropes tightened around their wrists, something unexpected happened. Instead of screams, singing rose into the smoke. Bound together, the sisters began a hymn, their voices trembling but steady. It was not a song of pleading, but of defiance. The words carried through the ruins like a challenge. The Ottoman captain watched in silence, unsure whether to mock them or stop the sound. He ordered the abbess dragged forward. Eleni still clutched the silver cross. Through an interpreter, the captain offered mercy. "Renounce your God," he said, "and your sisters will live." Eleni did not shout. She did not weep. She answered simply that her life was already given, and there was nothing left to take. For a moment, the captain hesitated. Then he turned away. What followed was never written in full. Later records called it discipline. Church chroniclers avoided detail. By dawn, the convent was ash. The bells were melted for coin. The cross from the roof was taken east as a trophy. Ottoman flags flew from the tower, signaling that resistance was over. Yet among the ruins, villagers whispered of something strange. When the wind passed through the broken stones at night, they said they could still hear voices, not crying, but praying. And far from the hills of Thessaly, a march had already begun. One that would carry those voices into the heart of an empire. A march of living. Proof the march began before the smoke had fully settled over the ruins. What remained of the order, 22 women in torn habits, were bound at the wrists and ankles and driven down from the hills like cargo that could still walk. Ottoman horsemen rode on either side, not rushing them, not sparing them, keeping a pace meant to exhaust without killing. The road twisted through olive groves and empty villages where doors were shut and windows dark. No one dared to speak to them. The sisters understood then that they were no longer individuals. They were a message, carried from place to place, so others would see what defiance earned. The journey stripped away the last illusions of mercy. The sun burned their skin by day, and cold crept into their bones at night. Most of the sisters had never left the convent walls in their lives. The road was uneven, sharp with stones that cut through thin sandals. When one stumbled, the rope pulled the others down with her, and they learned quickly to move as one body or suffer together. Hunger hollowed their faces, but thirst was worse. Water was given carefully, never enough, always as a reminder of control. Even so, they shared what little they had, lifting veils to shade one another, whispering prayers when guards were out of earshot not along the way. Villagers were forced to watch. Some crossed themselves in secret. Others turned away in fear. The Ottomans wanted witnesses, not sympathy. These women were not being taken as prisoners of war. They were living proof that even sacred vows could be broken by empire. The sisters sensed it in the way soldiers pointed them out, in the way captains spoke of them loudly at roadside camps, making sure the words carried. "This is what happens," the empire said without speaking, "when you refuse to disappear." After days of walking, exhaustion began to claim them. One sister collapsed near a dry stream, her body too weak to rise. A soldier raised his boot, ready to end the delay, but another stopped him. She was dragged instead, half-conscious, leaving a trail in the dust. That night, as they slept bound together under the open sky, the sisters understood something deeper than fear. Death was not the punishment prepared for them. Survival was. To live long enough to be displayed, questioned, reshaped, and emptied of meaning was the real sentence. On the seventh day, the smell of salt reached them before they saw the sea. The port of Volos lay ahead, crowded with ships, warehouses, and armed guards. For the sisters, it might as well have been the edge of the world. They were herded toward the docks where Ottoman galleys waited, their hulls scarred and heavy with iron rings. These ships were not built for comfort or faith. They were tools of movement, designed to carry bodies away from everything they knew not as they were forced aboard. Wrists shackled to wooden benches once used by criminals and slaves, the shoreline began to fade behind them. The hills of Thessaly disappeared into haze. With them went the last visible trace of home. None of the sisters cried. They sat in silence, rocking with the motion of the ship, already learning the discipline of endurance. They did not yet know where they were being taken, only that the empire did not bring such captives to places of mercy. And as the sails filled with wind and the oars began their rhythm, the sisters realized the march had not ended. It had only changed shape, carrying them toward a fate the world would later struggle to name. The ledger that should not exist, the voyage stripped away time. Days and nights blurred together beneath the low deck where the sisters were chained, the air thick with salt, sweat, and rot. Storms rolled across the sea without warning, slamming waves against the hull until the timbers groaned like something alive and suffering. When water flooded the deck, it mixed with blood from split skin and rust from iron shackles, soaking their garments until they clung heavy and cold. Food came once a day, thrown down without words, just enough to keep bodies moving. What hurt more than hunger was the silence. The guards spoke around them, never to them, as if acknowledging their humanity would weaken the order they had been given. In that silence, the sisters learned that being ignored was another form of erasure, a way to make people feel as though they had already vanished dot above them. The ship's overseer kept records. His name was Yusuf Aga, a man known more for ink than for the sword. He logged everything with care, sacks of grain, barrels of oil, crates of cloth, and among them, a single cold line that reduced 22 lives to a category. Religious captives, female, Thessaly. No prayers were noted, no hymns, no resistance. Just numbers and destinations. Centuries later, that ledger would be found in an archive in Istanbul, its pages stained by wax and sea damp, confirming what many historians once dismissed as exaggeration or myth. At the time, None of the sisters knew this. They only felt the weight of being counted as objects, as something to be delivered intact rather than understood. At night, when the sea calmed and the oars fell silent, Sister Magdalena whispered psalms beneath her breath. She was the youngest, her voice thin from hunger, yet it carried across the dark hold. Other captives, Greeks, Serbs, Italians chained nearby, turned their heads toward the sound. No one joined her aloud, but the listening itself became an act of quiet rebellion. For brief moments, the ship felt suspended between worlds, neither fully belonging to land nor empire. Those moments never lasted. By day, the guards returned, and the sisters shrank back into themselves, conserving strength, counting breaths, marking time by the creak of ropes and the distant cry of seabirds. When the ship finally entered the Bosphorus, the light changed. The city rose before them like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Constantinople gleamed in the early sun, domes and minarets catching the light so sharply it hurt to look at them. This was the city of the world's desire, the heart of empire, where law and conquest lived side by side. As they were marched from the docks through narrow streets, people stopped to stare. Christian nuns among captives were rare, unsettling even in a city accustomed to chains. They were led past walls older than memory, and into districts where decisions were made that never reached the streets. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, once a cathedral, now transformed, one sister whispered that they had come home, but it no longer belonged to them. By nightfall, they were taken beyond public view toward marble courtyards and guarded gates into a space where names would be rewritten and faith measured against power, and where the next test, far more calculated than violence, was already waiting. The imperial offer before dawn, the sisters were led into a marble courtyard surrounded by towering columns that caught the pale light and reflected it without warmth. This was not a dungeon, and not a place of chains and screams. It was far more dangerous than that. Here, decisions were made quietly, recorded carefully, and carried out without spectacle. This was the domain of imperial order, where cruelty wore the mask of law. At the center of the hall sat officials whose faces revealed nothing, men trained to look past suffering and see only outcomes. Scribes waited nearby with parchment and ink, ready to turn living people into entries that would survive long after their voices were gone. Through translators, the terms were delivered calmly, almost gently. The Sultan, they were told, was merciful. Conversion would bring food, rest, and protection within the palace. New names would be given, clean and useful, freeing them from the burden of their former lives. Those who accepted would live. Those who refused would face the discipline of faith, a phrase left deliberately vague. It was not shouted. It did not need to be. Everyone in the room understood what it meant. Disappearance, imprisonment, or a slow wasting that left no record worth keeping. The sisters stood in torn habits, eyes lowered, their hands still marked by iron. No one rushed them. Time itself became part of the pressure. Sister Magdalena trembled, her breath shallow, as she watched the officials' pens hover above the page, waiting. She had seen other captives before them, men broken by the promise of survival. But before fear could claim her, an older woman stepped forward. Sister Damaris had lived long enough to see borders change and rulers fall. She spoke not as a captive pleading for mercy, but as someone who understood how power tried to disguise itself. She said that names could be taken and tongues forced to repeat new words, but prayers carried in the heart could not be rewritten. The interpreter hesitated, aware of the risk in translating such defiance. When the words were finally spoken, the officials did not react. There was no anger, no raised voice. The Grand Vizier simply observed her, as one might study a tool that had failed to work as expected. He replied that prayers fade when the tongue forgets how to speak them, and with a slight motion of his hand, the matter was decided. The sisters were not sent to execution. They were dismissed. To some, it might have looked like mercy. To those who understood the empire, it was something far more deliberate. They were taken from the light into the lower chambers of the palace, places rarely mentioned in records and never shown to visitors. Stone corridors narrowed as they descended, the air growing colder, the sounds of the city fading until only footsteps and breathing remained. This was where unclassified captives went, those not yet assigned a purpose or erased outright. There, habits were stripped away and replaced with rough garments meant for labor. They were told they would serve, cleaning floors, sewing, tending fires, for rooms they would never enter. It was a quiet punishment, designed to drain meaning from devotion, to make holiness feel small and pointless. What the empire misjudged was the nature of the women it tried to break. These were not people unfamiliar with silence, hunger, or repetition. Vows had trained them for deprivation long before chains ever touched their skin. As they were led into their narrow chambers, each with only a thin slit of light, the sisters exchanged no words. They did not need to. They understood that something worse than death had begun, a slow test not of the body, but of memory itself. The palace beneath the palace, the days beneath the palace, lost their edges. Light entered their chambers only as a pale line that shifted across the stone like a reluctant visitor, never staying long enough to offer comfort. The sisters learned to measure time by sound rather than sight, the distant rhythm of footsteps above them, the echo of doors opening and closing, the muffled call to prayer drifting down through layers of stone. They were assigned work that never ended and never mattered, scrubbing floors that would be dirtied again, washing linens for people whose faces they would never see, feeding fires that warmed rooms they were forbidden to enter. It was labor without dignity, designed not to exhaust the body, but to convince the spirit that nothing it did held value. At first, they were treated with strict indifference. Food was plain and scarce, just enough to keep them standing. Conversation was forbidden, names erased. Each woman was given a number, a mark of ownership that replaced identity. Guards avoided looking at them directly, as if eye contact might acknowledge something they were ordered not to see. Yet even in this silence, the sisters found ways to resist. At night, when the corridors quieted, they prayed without words, pressing fingers together, tracing crosses into dust and clay with broken nails. One carved a small symbol into the wall, so lightly it could be mistaken for a crack. Another memorized fragments of scripture, passing them along in whispers too soft to be punished. Soon whispers spread among the palace servants. There were stories of foreign women married beneath the gardens who never begged and never spoke. Some called them cursed, others called them saints. The empire responded not with force, but with strategy. One evening, food arrived warm. Oil was added to their lamps. New garments, softer than the rough cloth they wore, were placed at their doors. Learned men followed, speaking gently, offering rest and understanding. They said the gods were not enemies, that faith could change shape without being lost. All it required was a single phrase, a public acceptance that would unlock comfort and safety. The kindness felt unnatural, like light that burned rather than warmed. The sisters understood the trap. To forget was the one sin they could not commit. When persuasion failed, the kindness vanished. Rations were cut, lamps were removed. Silence returned heavier than before. Then the summons began. One by one, the sisters were taken from their chambers to a narrow room where scribes waited. There, each was told to repeat words of submission. Those who did were dressed in clean clothes and led away. Those who refused were returned, thinner and quieter, or not returned at all. There were no executions, no cries echoing through the halls. Disappearance was enough. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins who had survived the march and the sea together, finally whispered the words. They were taken away in silence, and no one spoke their names again. The loss hardened those who remained. Sister Damaris, once strong before the vizier, grew frail, her body bending under the weight of months without light. When guards demanded her name, she answered only with stillness. Her defiance spread. From that moment on, the sisters refused speech altogether. Questions were met with silence, orders with empty stares. In refusing to respond, they reclaimed the last thing the empire sought to take. Control over how they were seen. Official records reduced them to a problem. Unresponsive captives. Failed conversions. By spring, only 11 of the original 22 remained. Guards began calling them ghosts. Servants whispered of hearing chanting beneath the palace at night, a sound that did not belong to any language they knew. It was the same hymn sung. As the convent burned, carried now through stone corridors meant to erase it. And in that growing darkness, the sisters discovered something unexpected, a sealed archway hidden behind rubble and neglect, a place that would become their final defiance and the key to a truth history tried to bury. The secret chapel and the truth unearthed the archway lay hidden behind centuries of dust and neglect, sealed not by design, but by forgetting. It was buried beneath collapsed stone and broken tiles, a narrow opening that once may have served as a service passage before the palace expanded above it. To the sisters, it became something else entirely. In a world stripped of symbols, this hollow space became sacred ground. They cleared it slowly, using bare hands and stolen moments between labor, careful not to leave signs that would draw attention. Broken pottery became candle holders. A torn strip of linen served as an altar cloth. From a shard of shattered mirror, they fashioned a crude cross, dull and uneven, yet more powerful to them than gold. Each night, when the palace above slept, the surviving sisters gathered there in silence. Their bodies were weak, their faces hollow, but something within them had hardened beyond reach. They no longer counted days or prayed for rescue. Instead, they prayed to remember. Names, faces, hymns, the sound of convent bells in the hills of Thessaly. In that hidden chamber, faith was no longer spoken aloud. It existed in presence alone. The empire had tried to exhaust them, to persuade them, to erase them slowly and quietly. What it created instead was something it could not catalog or control. Above ground, the palace moved on. Officials rotated. Records were updated. The sisters faded into margins and footnotes. Foreign captives, unproductive, unresolved. Some scribes stopped listing them entirely. For the empire, silence meant success. Yet among servants and guards, stories persisted. There were whispers of a place beneath the palace, where the air felt heavy, where lamps flickered without wind. Some claimed to hear chanting late at night, a sound unlike prayer or song, something older and more defiant. Superstitious guards avoided certain corridors. No orders were written to investigate. Fear, like faith, thrived best when left unnamed. By the time summer returned to the palace gardens, only a handful of sisters remained alive. Their bodies were failing, but they no longer feared death. What mattered was that they had not surrendered what the empire demanded most, forgetting who they were. When the last of them vanished from the registers, the palace did not mark the occasion. There was no punishment, no mercy, only absence. History, it seemed, had done what empires always hoped it would do. It moved on. Centuries later, a different kind of invasion took place. Scholars digging through Ottoman archives uncovered a damaged ledger, its pages brittle, its ink faded. Among lists of goods and captives, one entry stood out. Religious women. Thessaly, unclassified, transferred to palace service. No outcome recorded. Around the same time, restoration work beneath the old palace uncovered sealed corridors and a collapsed archway. Inside were crude candle marks, scratched symbols, fragments of linen preserved in dry air, and a small shard of glass etched with the unmistakable shape of a cross. There were no bodies, no names, only evidence that someone had prayed there for a very long time. Historians argued over the meaning. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others recognized a pattern too familiar to ignore. What could not be broken by force had been buried instead. The story of the nuns of Thessaly was never meant to survive. It lived on not in monuments or official chronicles, but in whispers, ruins, and a ledger that should never have existed. Their punishment was not death. It was being erased while still breathing, turned into a warning rather than a memory dot in the end. The secret they left behind was not just about faith or cruelty. It was about power and what it does when it fears what it cannot command. Empires fall, palaces crumble, but beneath the stone in silence, traces remain. And when they resurface, they force an uncomfortable truth into the light. The most terrifying acts in history are not always the ones written in blood. They are the ones carefully hidden, waiting centuries to be heard again.